archive of his work is available at www.democracyuprising.com. And since we've all talked long enough, I'm very pleased to introduce Mark Engler.
I'm going to be talking about some big picture issues, about whether the United States should have an empire in the world, whether the United States can afford to have an empire, even if it wants to have one in the world. What kind of interactions and what kind of solidarity can we have with people in other countries? But at the same time, those global issues are, of course, connected to work that's going on locally. And these are exactly the groups that people can plug into, that are doing things locally around, not just global justice issues, but also local justice issues. Whether that's Catholic Peace Ministries, whether that's AFSC, whether that's WILF, or any number of the groups that have been involved. I believe that we've lived now through two failed visions of globalization. We've lived through the corporate globalization of the Clinton years, and we lived through the imperial globalization of the Bush years. And both of these have been rejected throughout the world, and both of them are creating backlash. So because of that, I've seen some major changes in the time, even in the 8 years I've been working as a writer focused on the global economy. And I think that there's a lot of very exciting things about those changes. Although we don't hear about it very much here in the United States, there are some very exciting things happening in globalization politics. Probably more than any time in the last 30 years, there's a level of openness in the debate and in the possibilities for choosing what sort of economic policies we want to have in the world. The first development is that the model of corporate globalization that was gaining so much power in the Clinton years, but that's failed to reduce poverty in the world, that model is now being discredited. And so some of the institutions that drew huge protests not very long ago, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, these are institutions that formed what was known as the Washington Consensus. These organizations have really lost a lot of power in the world, and that's a very positive thing. Just a few years ago, from its offices in Washington, the IMF was virtually running economies in many different parts of the world. And because Washington, because the US Treasury controls the IMF, this put the United States in a very undemocratic position of economic control, of being an economic overlord over other countries. The IMF's loan portfolio has dwindled from almost $100 billion in 2004 to under $20 billion today. And just two countries, Turkey and Pakistan, hold the vast bulk of its outstanding loans. Much larger regions, like Latin America, are totally in revolt or in rebellion against that system of undemocratic control. So as recently as 2005, Latin America accounted for 80% of IMF lending. Today, that is less than 1%. While the corporate model of globalization that we saw in the Clinton years have come upon hard times, another vision of what I call imperial globalization has come to the fore in the Bush years. And I think that we all know some of the consequences of Bush administration foreign policy, but most notably, it got us into the disastrous war in Iraq. But because there's backlash against that Bush agenda, backlash here in the United States, backlash internationally, the imperial model has ironically helped to create a lot of opportunities for change right now in the world. People are rejecting that vision of the United States as an empire, and therefore that's creating space in the world. And ultimately, the book is written in the hopes that the corporate vision and the imperial vision for globalization, that neither will prevail. So a large part of the book is about the question of alternatives, about the possibilities for creating a globalization from below or a democratic globalization as these other models fall by the wayside. I think there's an important argument that we have to reject the Bush strategy, the imperial strategy of military dominance for the United States. But we cannot simply return to a Clinton plan of corporate control. And I think our challenge right now, and it's going to be our challenge in this election cycle and after this election cycle, is to go beyond that, to advocate for something better than the Clinton plan. The very conservative ideas about running the international economy that have dominated for the past 30 years are now facing a real crisis of legitimacy. We've lived through 30 years where the dominant belief was that we should hand over ever larger sections of public life to the market, hand over ever larger sections of public life to large corporations, and hope that the wealth created at the very top of the system would somehow trickle down. And of course, we know that it doesn't trickle down. So those ideas, that set of ideas that's dominated for 30 years is now under assault, and that's a very exciting thing. And understanding this is really important to understanding what's going on throughout Latin America right now. Because globalization can encompass huge trends in culture and telecommunications. And neoliberalism, in contrast, is something very specific. And it goes back to that set of market fundamentalist ideas I was talking about before. This is a set of policies: privatization, deregulation, cutting social services. So that means selling off public goods to private owners. It means deregulation, letting corporate lobbyists write the rules for their own industry. It means austerity, rolling back the welfare state, rolling back social services, and ending protections for workers or for small businesses. That is the neoliberal agenda. And I think that there's a very important point here that a lot of times we're not talking about globalization as a technological phenomenon, as a vague phenomenon. We're talking about that agenda. And they've been able to hide that agenda into this much broader discussion of globalization. These neoliberal policies are the policies that have been imposed on countries throughout the global south, and they're not just happening abroad. In the United States under Reagan, in Great Britain under Margaret Thatcher, we started seeing a parallel process that continues today of privatization, of an upward redistribution of resources, and of cuts to social services. This neoliberalism is being opposed throughout much of the world, oftentimes successfully, even as we speak. When this stuff first got started in the 1970s, these ideas of corporate globalization were a very far out set of market fundamentalist ideas that had not been tested in the real world. These were popular in the academy. They were popular in places like with Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. But the policymakers considered this stuff way too far out to actually put into practice. There was always understood that the market by itself would create huge imbalances and huge inequalities, and that you needed some public role to remedy that. Well, recently, people like some writers like Naomi Klein have done a great job of telling the story of how neoliberalism, how corporate globalization started being implemented. And this wasn't implemented under particularly democratic, open, free circumstances. In fact, it was often implemented in the most undemocratic of circumstances. Not only are the mainstream economists defecting, but the countries themselves want out. And this is most clearly illustrated by the fact that the countries burned by the Asian financial crisis a decade ago are now building up huge currency reserves. And that means that they never again have to come back to Washington. They never again have to come back begging to the IMF in times of crisis. And as a result, the IMF now has very little say about what's going on in these other economies. In Latin America, you've had a sweeping series of over a dozen elections since the year 2000 that have put progressive leaders into power. It doesn't end in November. And if a Democrat is elected, there has to be real social movement pressure to stop a shift back to that same old paradigm of free market fundamentalism. A very substantial part of the book is about that question of alternatives, about that vision of democratic globalization. The Bush militarism is one thing that's made all these changes in Latin America possible, in that by focusing on the Middle East, by getting us into the war in Iraq, by being obsessed with the military and with the institutions of hard power instead of the mechanisms of economic control, the militarists in Washington have actually created a lot of room for Latin America to sort of maneuver, oftentimes beneath the radar. And because they tried to implement those programs of imperial globalization, it's created that backlash throughout the world. This is being rejected. People are demanding something different. That's the moment we're entering into right now. I think it has a lot of hopeful and exciting potentials. Thank you again for coming.